He handed his own son $30,000 for a dream vacation to Hawaii, only to be told at the airport with a cold smirk, "I forgot to buy your ticket, go home." The words cut sharper than any knife, turning a gift of love into a public humiliation. Strangers stared as the man who built the family's life was dismissed like an unwanted guest. Rage simmered beneath the silence, but he gave no scene, no protest, only a calm nod that concealed a storm. What came next would turn paradise into a nightmare. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from to see how this unfolds. He stood there, the sterile light of the terminal casting long shadows across the polished floor, and in that moment he saw everything with brutal clarity. This was no accident, no careless oversight from a busy son juggling work and family. It was theater carefully rehearsed and performed with chilling precision. Daniel's eyes darted to the screen above, pretending to study the departure times, while Melissa clutched her phone like a stage prop, feigning concern as if she could fix this terrible misunderstanding. Their bodies were too still, their timing too perfect. He had spent a lifetime reading blueprints, measuring angles, and catching flaws before they collapsed into disasters. And now, in the lines of his son's hunched shoulders and his daughter-in-law's calculated size, he recognized a flaw not of chance, but of design. They had planned this. They had set him up. The noise of the crowd around him blurred into a low hum, a background track to their performance. He replayed the moments leading to this humiliation like frames in a film. The brand new luggage. Daniel insisted upon the urgency with which Melissa had hustled the children through the check-in line, the way both of them seemed almost too eager, too tightly wound, as if waiting for a cue. And here it was, the reveal, the cruel twist. He wasn't a guest of honor on this family trip. He was the obstacle to be discarded. The realization settled in his chest, heavier than the leather bag hanging at his side. He felt the veins in his hands tighten against the handle, but his face betrayed nothing. Melissa's gasp, loud enough to draw glances from the line behind them, rang false in his ears. Her performance carried all the polish of a woman who had practiced in front of a mirror. Her widened eyes, her fluttering hands, her dramatic tilt of the head, every gesture was a costume change, a quick transformation to sell the illusion of sympathy. Yet beneath that veneer he saw the calculation, the satisfaction of a role well played. She was not surprised. She was reveling in the scene. Daniel finally met his father's gaze, but there was nothing genuine in the shallow apology he offered. "Dad? I'm so sorry," he mumbled, as though the words themselves were foreign on his tongue. He spoke of chaos, of stress, of forgetting. But his father knew the cadence of truth, and this was not it. These were the hollow lines of a man caught in his own script. The son he once carried on his shoulders had grown into a stranger who could dismiss $30,000 of sacrifice with a shrug. As the agent behind the counter shifted uncomfortably, sensing the tension but bound by the rules of her job, he understood that this was more than negligence. It was a coup, a silent rebellion orchestrated not to forget him, but to erase him. The ticket wasn't missing by accident. It had never been purchased. It was a deliberate absence, a way to exile him without the need for confrontation. He had funded their paradise, but they had decided he would not set foot in it. The marble floor beneath his shoes felt colder with each breath. He watched the subtle relief cross Daniel's face when he did not explode, when he did not shout or cause a scene. They had expected resistance, perhaps even a desperate plea. Instead, he gave them silence. He gave them the unnerving calm of a man who saw through the curtain and knew the play was already over. Inside, rage pressed against the walls of his chest, demanding to break free, but he held it. He let the fury sharpen, not scatter. His eyes fell on the children standing to the side, their innocence untouched by this quiet betrayal. Leo fiddled with the zipper of his jacket, confused, sensing something wrong, but not understanding the cruelty unfolding. Maya clung to her mother's hand, glancing between faces, searching for cues. They were spectators too, but unlike the strangers in line, they would one day grow into the truth of what they witnessed. That thought burned him more deeply than the humiliation itself. Melissa leaned closer to Daniel, whispering just loud enough for him to hear, "We should go. Boarding starts soon." Her tone was smooth, practiced, not frantic, not regretful, simply efficient, like a woman checking tasks off a list. She wanted him gone quickly, neatly, before the mask slipped. He gave a slow nod, his voice, even his words, deliberate. "All right, son. Have a safe flight." The sentence rolled off his tongue with the precision of a craftsman measuring a final cut. Daniel's shoulders sagged with relief, a tell he didn't even notice. Melissa smiled faintly, already turning toward the gate, her performance complete. They believed they had managed him, contained him, outmaneuvered him. They mistook silence for surrender. As he walked toward the exit, each step became a drumbeat of clarity. This was not about a ticket. This was not about money. This was a declaration. They no longer saw him as father, as patriarch, as builder of their world. They saw him only as a resource, a bank to be drained, a problem to be managed. And in that recognition, the sting of humiliation cooled into something harder, something far more dangerous. The betrayal was not a wound to wallow in. It was evidence clear and undeniable. The taxi ride back blurred in streaks of light and glass, his reflection overlaying the cityscape like a double exposure. For a brief second, he saw the hollow outline of a weary old man, but then the image shifted. The man staring back at him was awake, sharp, unbroken. His son's words echoed in his mind. Go home, but they no longer sounded like dismissal. They sounded like strategy. They sounded like orders he had given himself. Go home, regroup, rebuild, strike. Back in the silence of his house, the air felt different, charged with a purpose that had not been there before. He lowered himself into the armchair by the window, the chair his wife Helen had once favored, and let her words return like a whisper through time. Money doesn't change a person. It only shows who they are. She had seen it before he did. He had mistaken generosity for love, but all he had done was fuel Daniel's weakness. His hands tightened around the arms of the chair. This was no longer about a missed vacation. This was about legacy, about dignity, about the truth of who he was and what he had built. They thought they had exiled him from their paradise. What they had really done was summon him back to his castle. And from his castle a king makes moves they cannot anticipate. The calm that spread through him was not resignation. It was the quiet before the storm, the cold calculation of a strategist who has just discovered the enemy's flaw. He knew their game now, knew the rehearsed lines, the staged apologies, the false concern. They had revealed themselves fully, and once someone reveals their hand, the game shifts. He leaned back, letting the late sunlight cut across the room, and allowed the silence to grow thick. His son believed he had won with 2 words, but what he had done was ignite something that could never be extinguished. The father was not broken. He was sharpening. He was building. And what came next would not be a plea for inclusion, but a lesson they would never forget. What neither Daniel nor Melissa realized was that the man they thought they had dismissed had already begun writing the blueprint for their undoing, and the first brick had just been set in place. The clerk's words sliced through the air like a blade, each syllable deliberate, final, impossible to mishear. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't find a reservation for you on this flight." For a moment, silence engulfed him. It wasn't just silence in his own ears. It was the vacuum created by dozens of strangers shifting, craning their necks, their gazes landing on him with a weight heavier than the bag strap biting into his shoulder. He felt their eyes as though they were flashlights exposing him under the sterile brightness of the terminal. They weren't passengers anymore. They were spectators at a public trial where the verdict had already been written. He could see it on their faces, the mixture of pity and suspicion, the quick mental calculations. An old man, gray at the temples, standing beside glossy new suitcases, clearly not his style, caught in some mess of his family's making. Some tilted their heads in sympathy, their lips pressing into thin lines. Others smirked, eyes darting toward his son and daughter-in-law, their polished clothes, their restless children already writing their own story. The bitter father who must have been too difficult, the burden quietly left behind. In an instant, his entire identity was stripped away and rewritten by strangers. He wasn't a builder of homes, a craftsman of wood and stone. The man who had poured sweat and years into providing for the very family who now turned from him. No, here in the fluorescent theater of Gate 14 he was reduced to one thing: a man without a ticket. Daniel's refusal to meet his eyes burned sharper than any words. The boy who once held his hand at county fairs now stared intently at a loose thread on his sleeve as though pulling it free was a task of national importance. Melissa let out another gasp, one so loud and tremulous it drew glances from even further down the line. "Oh my goodness," she breathed, clutching her chest, her voice dripping with a syrupy sweetness meant for the crowd, not for him. She leaned into her role like an actress savoring the spotlight. The clerk gave a polite, apologetic smile, but her voice grew firmer as she repeated, "Sir, there really is no booking for you." The words stung not for what they meant, but for how they echoed. No booking. No place. No space reserved. And beneath that, the truth that hit harder than the eyes of strangers: no place in their family. He could feel the shame rising in his chest like heat crawling up his neck, reddening his ears. His hands flexed against the leather handle of his bag, veins straining, but his face remained calm. That was his discipline, honed over years of work, of mistakes corrected before collapse. He would not give them the performance they craved. Yet inside every second stretched torturous, a moment where his dignity was hung on display like a curiosity. He imagined the whispers already forming in the line behind him, voices low but slicing. Poor man. Did they really forget him? Maybe he should have checked himself. Maybe they never wanted him there to begin with. The sting wasn't just humiliation, it was exposure. He was being erased, not in private, not behind closed doors, where betrayal at least allows for quiet grief, but under the watchful eyes of strangers who would walk away with their own neat conclusions. He was no longer father, provider, builder. He was reduced to a punchline in someone else's anecdote, a story passengers might retell later over dinner. He thought of Helen in that instant, her voice soft but firm, always reminding him that respect was not given. It was maintained brick by brick, action by action. What would she have said seeing him there? Would her eyes have flashed in indignation, her lips pressed thin at the audacity of their son? Or would she have looked at him, urging him to hold steady, to let silence cut deeper than rage? He could almost hear her reminding him of the power and composure of the way real strength was quiet. Melissa's voice broke his thoughts. "We'll see if we can find something. Won't we, honey?" she chirped, her fingers tapping across her phone screen, perfectly aware of the audience leaning in. She turned the device outward with a sigh of defeat. "Oh no, the only available ticket is nearly $3,000, and it wouldn't even seat him with us." She shook her head with theatrical sorrow, as though the cruelty of fate itself had placed its hand upon her. The crowd stirred again, sympathetic eyes landing on her, believing in her act. He saw it clearly now, the set, the actors, the script. He was not part of their story. He was the discarded extra. The shame hardened into something heavier, colder. He felt it settle in his chest like steel. Let them stare. Let them murmur. Let Melissa clutch her pearls and Daniel shuffle like a guilty schoolboy. None of their gazes mattered, because in the quiet theater of his mind another audience waited, the memory of every beam he'd raised, every table he'd built, every night he stayed up late balancing books so Daniel could have braces, so there would be food on the table and a roof overhead. That was the truth, not this performance. And truth had a way of returning sharper than any judgment. He gave one last look at the clerk, whose eyes held a flicker of something close to pity. He didn't want her pity. He didn't need it. He gave her the briefest of nods, a gesture of acknowledgement, and stepped back, ceding the space for the next passengers. He did not argue. He did not plead. He let the silence stand heavy and immovable until Daniel shifted uncomfortably, his act faltering for a fraction of a second. That was enough. As he turned toward the exit, the terminal seemed louder than before, the rolling suitcases harsher, the voices brighter. Yet within him there was a quiet, razor-sharp stillness. The humiliation was undeniable, yes. He had been reduced, stripped, forced into a role he never chose. But humiliation, he realized, was not an end. It was a seed. And when planted in the right soil, humiliation could grow into something formidable. He walked with slow precision, each step carrying him further from the stage they had crafted and deeper into his own design. The stares lingered, but he did not care. He had been publicly cast out, and there was no erasing that sting. But the public nature of it made it worse for them than they understood. A son who discards his father before witnesses does not simply betray in secret. He brands himself forever before others' eyes. Daniel did not yet realize that shame cuts both ways. The doors to the terminal slid open, spilling him into the cool air outside. For the first time he inhaled deeply the sterile recycled air replaced with the bite of the city breeze. He felt the humiliation there, yes, but beneath it he felt something else taking form, solidifying with each breath. They thought they had diminished him. They thought they had sent him home empty. What they had really done was awaken something they could not control. As the taxi pulled up, he gripped the door handle and lowered himself inside, his movements deliberate, his gaze steady. In the reflection of the window, the man looking back at him was not broken. He was tempered. And what awaited Daniel and Melissa would not be another act of forgiveness, not another blank check to cover their failings. It would be something far colder, far more permanent. The stage was no longer theirs. It was his. What they believed was a moment of victory at the check-in counter was nothing more than the overture to a story they had not written and would not control. The real performance, the one that would bring their carefully rehearsed lives crashing down, was only just beginning. Melissa tilted the phone in her manicured hand, her face contorting into a mask of sympathy so polished it could have fooled a stranger. Her brows arched, her lips parted in a sigh, rehearsed 1,000 times in bathroom mirrors, and her voice quivered just enough to sound convincing. "Oh, no," she whispered, tilting the screen toward the clerk, toward Daniel, toward the invisible audience of passers-by who lingered nearby curious. "There is one seat left, but it's $3,000, and it wouldn't even be with us." Her eyes flicked to him, then glistening with a counterfeit sorrow that had no depth. He stared at her, the woman his son had chosen to bring into the family, and saw only theater. Every move calculated, every gesture performed for effect. She wasn't trying to help. She was trying to look like she wanted to help. It was a performance staged for everyone but him. The sigh that followed, heavy and deliberate, was the punctuation mark on her act. She gave the impression of someone desperately seeking solutions while secretly savoring the spectacle. To the untrained eye, she appeared caught in a bind, helplessly bound by circumstance. But to him who had built a life by detecting flaws no one else noticed, the cracks in her mask shone like fissures under a spotlight. Her head shook slowly as though weighed down by tragedy itself, and her hand found Daniel's arm. "It's just too much," she murmured. Her voice pitched for pity. "It's impossible." Her words weren't meant to comfort him. They were meant to confirm his exclusion, to seal it with the authority of financial burden. $3,000, she tossed the number into the air like a brick too heavy to lift, knowing full well it was his money that had already paved their way to this moment. He felt the sting of disgust coil in his chest, not sharp like anger, but slow and corrosive, eating away at the last remnants of respect he had tried to hold. She wasn't even ashamed. She relished it, standing in the glow of her own deception. He could almost hear the inner monologue she crafted for herself, the dutiful daughter-in-law who tried, who cared, who wanted to fix things, but simply couldn't. And later, when they retold the story to friends, or perhaps to justify it to themselves, she would play the hero who attempted to bridge the gap, the one who almost rescued the poor old man from being left behind. Almost. The falseness of it made his skin crawl. He had seen lies before, small lies, to protect, to soften, to shield from pain. But this was different. This was malice wrapped in kindness, cruelty disguised as pity. And Melissa wielded it like a scalpel, slicing his dignity with feigned sorrow. Daniel stood beside her, silent, complicit, his eyes darting between the phone and the floor, never quite meeting his father's gaze. He was letting her run the show, allowing her performance to cloak his cowardice. His son had built a life on the foundation his father provided, and now he let a woman with painted lips and hollow sympathy dictate the script. The clerk shifted again, her discomfort growing. She glanced at him, searching for some cue, some reaction. He gave her none. He refused to add another line to Melissa's act. His silence was his defiance, his refusal to play the fool in her drama. He thought of Helen again, his late wife who could spot insincerity in a heartbeat. She had once warned him, her voice calm but unwavering, that Melissa's sweetness had edges too sharp to ignore. He had brushed it aside, believing time would soften the edges, that love would temper ambition. Now, standing in the glare of fluorescent lights surrounded by gawking strangers, he saw how right she had been. Melissa pressed the phone to her chest like a relic, sighing once more. "I wish we could make it work," she said, her eyes shimmering with false compassion, but her body was already angled toward the gate, her weight leaning forward, her entire posture betraying her eagerness to move on, to leave him behind. He studied her carefully, committing every detail to memory, the deliberate tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted just slightly upward, as if to check whether the crowd believed her, the faint upward curl of her lips when she thought no one was watching. These were not the signs of helplessness. They were the tells of a woman savoring victory. The disgust solidified into something colder, sharper. He understood now that Melissa was not simply along for the ride. She was driving it, hands firmly on the wheel, steering Daniel down this path. The exile had her fingerprints all over it. And with that realization came clarity. He had been humiliated, yes. Stripped of dignity in public, yes. But this play of false kindness, this charade of power cloaked in pity, had revealed more than she intended. She had shown her hand. She had exposed herself not as a concerned daughter-in-law, but as an architect of betrayal. And in exposing herself, she had given him exactly what he needed: knowledge. He let the silence stretch, a silence that made Daniel fidget, and Melissa glanced nervously, her performance faltering for a split second. In that hesitation he saw fear flicker across her face. Not fear of losing him, but fear of being seen through. He turned away, then slowly, deliberately ignoring the weight of the stares, the murmurs of strangers, the shallow apologies floating behind him. Melissa's voice followed, thin and strained. "We tried, Dad, really we tried." But the words fell flat, their hollowness echoing in the sterile air. He walked toward the sliding doors, the cool breeze rushing in as they parted. The taste of it was cleaner than the recycled air of the terminal, sharper like a blade rinsed in cold water. He carried the image of Melissa's false compassion with him, not as a wound, but as evidence. Evidence of the rot that had crept into the family he built. As the taxi pulled away from the curb, he stared out the window, the city blurring past. Melissa thought she had sealed his fate with her counterfeit sorrow. She thought her sighs and sympathetic glances had buried him beneath humiliation. But what she had really done was ignite something far more dangerous than rage. Because pity can be performed, lies can be rehearsed, but truth has a way of cutting through the thickest masks. And he now carried that truth like a weapon, waiting for the right moment to strike. What Daniel and Melissa believed was the end of his journey was only the beginning of theirs, and they would soon learn that false kindness often costs more than $3,000. It costs everything. Daniel's hand landed on his father's shoulder with the weight of a verdict, not a gesture of comfort. The palm pressed lightly, but the message carried the force of dismissal. His son leaned close, lowering his voice just enough so the crowd would hear only the tone, not the words, and said, "Just go home, Dad. We'll bring you a souvenir." The phrase hung in the air, cheap and hollow, a trinket offered in place of belonging. It wasn't just rejection. It was the stripping away of dignity, as if decades of sacrifice could be reduced to a keychain or a t-shirt from a tourist shop. The words didn't sting like fire. They froze. They crawled under his skin and turned the blood in his veins to ice. He had been called many things in his life: provider, builder, husband, father. But in that moment, under the fluorescent lights and the indifferent gaze of strangers, His son labeled him something else entirely unnecessary. A burden, an afterthought that could be soothed with a souvenir. He kept his face still, though. The discipline of years wouldn't crack here. Not now, not before the eyes of passengers shuffling past with their roller bags and headphones. Not before the clerk who had already seen too much. Not before Melissa, who stood watching with her arms crossed, her lips pressed in the faintest curl of victory. His silence was not submission, it was strategy. Daniel's grip lingered for a moment longer, then retreated, as if the touch itself might burn. The father felt the absence like a chill colder than the air conditioning pouring from the vents. He caught the faint smell of Melissa's perfume cloying heavy, designed to linger as she stepped toward the gate. Daniel followed the children pulled along, chattering about beaches and pineapples, their innocence a cruel contrast to the rot in their parents' choices. For a moment the father stood still, the noise of the terminal pressing in. Announcements blared over loudspeakers. Travelers shuffled impatiently, and still he remained anchored there, the echo of his son's words reverberating like a drumbeat in his skull. Go home. Souvenir. Go home. Souvenir. They weren't words of care. They were orders, a dismissal, a closing of a door that could never be reopened. He turned slowly, his bag pulling at his shoulder, and began to walk toward the exit. Every step felt measured, deliberate, as if he were pacing out a blueprint in his mind. He imagined the way Daniel had looked when he said it, the way his lips had pressed into a thin smile of relief, as though the problem had been solved neatly. His son thought the matter closed, tied off, forgotten. But what Daniel failed to see was the tightening jaw, the stillness in his father's eyes, the storm coiled beneath the surface. Outside, the glass doors parted with a hiss, and the late afternoon air struck him humid and heavy. Cars honked, brakes squealed, engines rumbled at the curb. A taxi idled its driver, waving him forward impatiently, but he stood still for a moment, staring at the ground. He could see the reflection of himself in the glass behind him. An older man in a worn jacket, hair silvered, posture straight despite the weight he carried. And behind that reflection, blurred in the glass, the figures of his son and daughter-in-law disappeared through the gate, walking into their paradise without him. The insult carved itself deeper with every passing second. Not the missing ticket, not the clerk's apology, not even Melissa's counterfeit sorrow. No, what seared him now was Daniel's phrase, flippant, thoughtless, as though exile could be softened with a souvenir. It was the cruelty of casualness, the insult of ease. That was what broke something inside him. Not a loud betrayal, but the quiet certainty that his son no longer saw him as essential. The taxi driver honked again. He climbed inside, his movements precise, his jaw clenched. The city blurred past in streaks of color and light as the car pulled into traffic. He barely heard the driver ask where to. Home, he muttered, the word tasting bitter on his tongue. But even as he said it, his mind was already elsewhere. He was not going home to rest. He was going home to think, to plan, to turn the chill in his chest into something sharper. The driver's radio crackled with static, a country song bleeding faintly through. He stared out the window, the rhythm of the tires against the pavement steady, soothing, almost hypnotic. His hands rested on his knees, fingers tapping lightly, not with impatience but with calculation. He thought of the years of labor that had gone into building the family's wealth, the long shifts, the sleepless nights, the risks taken and paid for in sweat. Every dollar Daniel now used so freely had once been earned through those hours, and now with a single phrase his son had revealed the depth of his ingratitude. He let the anger settle not as fire, but as ice. Fire burns, quickly consumes itself, leaves nothing but ash. Ice endures. Ice cuts slow and deep. Ice waits. That was what he felt growing inside him. A cold, patient fury, the kind that reshapes landscapes, not with an explosion, but with persistence. The taxi pulled into his driveway, the familiar sight of his house greeting him like an ally. The porch he had built with his own hands, the oak door he had sanded smooth, the fence painted each spring. This was his domain, the castle carved from years of labor. Here his son's words lost their power. Here he was not unnecessary. Here he was king. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, the click of the lock echoing like a gunshot in the quiet. He hung his jacket, set down his bag, and walked into his study. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old books, the air cool and still. He sat at the desk, the leather chair creaking under his weight, and placed his hands flat on the polished surface. The silence thickened, pressing in from the walls, from the floor, from the ceiling. In that silence he began to build. Not with wood or stone, not with nails or mortar, but with thought, with resolve, with the clarity that comes only when humiliation hardens into purpose. Daniel believed a souvenir could replace a father. Melissa believed performance could replace sincerity. They both believed silence meant surrender. But they were wrong. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment, his breathing steady. In the darkness behind his eyelids he saw their faces, their laughter as they boarded, their relief as the plane lifted into the sky without him. He let the image burn itself into his memory, not as pain, but as fuel. Every betrayal has its cost, and theirs was coming due. The hum of the refrigerator in the next room filled the quiet. The tick of the old clock on the wall kept time steady, relentless. He sat there motionless, the cold fury solidifying in his veins, a blueprint taking shape in his mind. His son thought he had told him to go home. What he didn't realize was that home was not a retreat. Home was a fortress. And from that fortress, a father who had been dismissed with the promise of a souvenir would craft something far more lasting, far more devastating than any trinket. The storm had already begun to gather, and when it broke it would not be loud, it would be unstoppable. "All right, son. You all have a safe flight." The words slid from his mouth with the calm ease of a man folding a note and slipping it into a pocket, quiet and unremarkable to anyone listening. To Daniel it was a relief, a cue that the storm had passed. To Melissa it was confirmation that her performance had worked, that the old man had accepted his exile. To the strangers around them it was the sigh of an elderly father letting go with dignity. But inside, beneath the composed surface, the phrase was no surrender. It was a blade slid silently into a sheath, hidden but ready. His nod sealed the illusion. He made no scene raised, no voice cast no accusation. The terminal returned to its rhythm around him, luggage wheels rattling overhead, announcements echoing, children whining in line. He let them believe he was subdued, that the humiliation had broken him into something manageable. Daniel gave him a quick pat on the back, the kind a man offers to a colleague at the end of a workday, perfunctory and hollow. Then he was gone, pulled into the current of boarding passengers, his wife gliding beside him like a queen certain of her court. The father remained standing for a moment, still as a statue. His lips pressed into a thin line, his gaze fixed not on the gate, but on the gleam of the polished floor beneath his shoes. In that reflection he saw himself smaller, diminished, but he knew better. Reflections lied. What the world saw was an old man dismissed with polite words. What existed within was altogether different, a mind sharpening with every second of silence. The air felt heavier as he turned his footsteps steady, deliberate. Each stride toward the exit was calculated, not the stumble of defeat, but the measured pace of a craftsman laying the first stones of a foundation. He carried the image of Daniel's relieved smile with him, locking it away, not as a wound but as a reminder. Relief was dangerous. It made men sloppy. His son had revealed everything in that smile, his belief that the matter was over, that his father was out of the way, that paradise awaited him without consequence. The sliding doors parted with a hiss, spilling him into the gray wash of late afternoon. Cars idled at the curb, their exhaust rising in ghostly plumes, horns blaring in the chaos of departure. He didn't rush. He let the cold air wash over him, cleansing the sterile scent of the terminal from his lungs. His bag was heavier now, though not from its contents. It carried the weight of his silence, of the unspoken vow taking shape inside him. The taxi driver waved him over, impatient, but he paused, glancing back once at the terminal's glass facade. Beyond those walls, his son and daughter-in-law believed themselves safe, tucked neatly into their narrative, convinced they had rid themselves of him with no more than a missing ticket and a condescending farewell. Let them believe it. Let them revel in their victory. Every illusion grows sweetest before it shatters. Inside the cab, he settled into the back seat, the door closing with a muted thud. "Home," he said, his voice low-controlled. The driver nodded and pulled into the stream of traffic. The city blurred past neon signs flickering against the encroaching dusk, pedestrians rushing home from work, unaware that somewhere in the back of a yellow cab, a father's humiliation was crystallizing into resolve. He rested his hands on his knees, fingers still no tapping, no fidgeting. Outwardly calm, inwardly calculating. He thought of the trust accounts, the properties, the investments Daniel had taken for granted as inevitable inheritance. He thought of the house Daniel lived in, the one his father still technically owned, though his son boasted of it as if it were his own. Every thread of security Daniel wrapped himself in had been woven by his father's labor. And just as easily, those threads could be pulled loose. The driver switched on the radio, a soft hum of talk shows and static filling the silence. He barely heard it. His mind moved through decades of sacrifice, each memory now reframed in the harsh light of betrayal. The nights on construction sites when he worked past midnight to meet deadlines, the years Helen had packed him lunches in paper bags with little notes folded inside, the way Daniel had once hugged him after college graduation and whispered, "Thanks, Dad. I couldn't have done it without you." Those moments had seemed permanent once engraved in the stone of memory. Now they felt like illusions, fragile as glass shattered by the ease with which Daniel had dismissed him. The cab slowed as it turned into his street, the familiar row of trees lining the sidewalks casting shadows across the pavement. His house loomed ahead, sturdy and unyielding, its porch lights glowing softly against the encroaching dark. This was his fortress, the monument to a life built by his own two hands. Here silence was not weakness. Here silence was strategy. He paid the driver his hand steady as he pulled bills from his wallet and stepped out. The air was cooler now, carrying the faint scent of pine from the trees. He stood at the base of the steps, looking up at the front door, at the windows glowing warmly from the inside. For the first time that day, he allowed himself a thin smile, not of happiness, but of certainty. They had sent him home, and home was the one place they should never have driven him. Inside, the house welcomed him with the quiet creak of old wood and the faint tick of the clock in the hallway. He slipped off his jacket, hung it neatly, and walked into his study. The room smelled of cedar, the shelves lined with books, the desk polished and waiting. He sat in the leather chair, its weight familiar grounding. From this seat he had made countless decisions, signed contracts, mapped out plans. Tonight he would begin again. He opened the drawer and pulled out a notepad, the pages crisp and empty. The pen in his hand felt heavier than usual, not just ink and metal, but an instrument of transformation. He wrote nothing at first, simply letting the silence fill the room, letting the events of the day replay in perfect clarity. Melissa's sighs. Daniel's refusal to meet his eyes. The clerk's pity. The stares of strangers, and finally that phrase. "Just go home, Dad. We'll bring you a souvenir." Each detail etched itself deeper, each one fuel for what was to come. He placed the pen to paper at last and began to draw, not words, not sentences, but lines, boxes, arrows. A map of intentions, a blueprint not of buildings, but of consequences. He moved slowly, deliberately, the same way he had always worked, ensuring no measurement was off. No detail overlooked. Revenge, like construction, required precision. The night deepened, outside the hum of distant traffic fading, the house settling into its bones. He did not move from his chair, did not rest. His silence had fooled them once at the terminal. It would fool them again until the moment came when silence gave way to revelation. What Daniel and Melissa believed was the end of their father's relevance was in truth the beginning of something they could never have anticipated. and soon they would discover that the calmest goodbyes often carry the sharpest consequences. The taxi rolled through the city, its headlights slicing through the dusk, and he sat in the back seat with his hands folded tightly in his lap. The silence pressed in around him, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the driver's radio. Neon signs flickered across his reflection in the window, and each one lit his face for a fleeting second before vanishing back into shadow. He looked older in that reflection than he felt inside, but not weaker. Something had changed in him the moment he turned his back on the gate. The humiliation still burned, yes, but beneath the sting was clarity, a rare kind that stripped away illusions. He thought of Helen. It had been nearly 5 years since she passed, yet tonight her voice came back to him with the precision of memory sharpened by grief. She had been the one who saw people clearly, who read hearts like open books while he was still busy building roofs and laying foundations. Her words were never cruel, never careless, but they cut through pretense like glass. He could almost hear her laughter now, soft and warm, rising out of the kitchen on Sunday mornings while she stirred batter in a mixing bowl. He remembered how she would look at Daniel even when he was a boy and shake her head slightly after one of his sulks or selfish demands. Later, when the boy was grown, she said it plainly. Money doesn't change a person, it just shows who they are. At the time, he had brushed it off. He told her Daniel was young, ambitious, distracted. He told her that mistakes were just signs of a man trying to build a life. But she had looked at him with those eyes that never flinched from truth, and she said, "You'll see it one day." He never wanted that day to come. Now it had arrived in the form of a missing ticket and a son who could dismiss him with a pat on the shoulder and the promise of a souvenir. His throat tightened as the memory of her voice grew stronger, mingling with the bitter air that seeped in through the cracked taxi window. She had known. She had seen the cracks long before they widened into fractures. Her death had left him vulnerable, blind to what she might have prevented. He had tried to be both mother and father, protector and provider, clinging to the hope that sacrifice alone could hold the family together. He realized now that sacrifice without gratitude only feeds greed. The driver turned onto a quieter street, the traffic thinning, and the father closed his eyes for a moment. He pictured Helen in her garden, her hands dirt-stained but graceful, pulling weeds and humming a tune from some old record they used to play in the evenings. He remembered the way she wiped sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand and said with that calm conviction of hers, "People don't change when they get money. They just get louder about who they already are." Daniel had been loud today, louder than ever, and the truth of him rang in every careless word. A pang of sorrow hit him sharp and sudden. He wished she were there to steady him, to remind him not to let anger consume him. But as quickly as the sorrow came, it settled into something steadier, something almost comforting. It was as if she was there in the silence, not as a ghost, but as a compass, guiding him toward the path he already knew he must take. Her absence no longer felt like a void. It felt like a voice urging him to see clearly. The taxi slowed to a stop in front of his house. The driver muttered the fare and he handed over cash without hesitation. His movements were calm, deliberate, but inside he felt the pulse of transformation. He stepped out into the night, the cool air brushing against his face, and looked up at the house he had built board by board. The porch lights glowed faintly, a reminder that this was still his domain, the place no one could exile him from. He walked up the steps, each one creaking under his weight, and paused at the front door. For years he had seen this house as a gift to his family, a monument to labor and love. Tonight he saw it differently. It was not just a gift, it was a fortress, and within it lay the tools of his future. Daniel thought he had cut his father out of the story, but in truth he had pushed him back into the center of it. Inside, the familiar smell of wood and old books wrapped around him like a cloak. He hung his jacket, set his bag down, and moved to the study. The room was quiet, lit only by the lamp on the desk. He sank into the leather chair, the same chair where he had once signed mortgage papers and contracts, where Helen had leaned on the doorframe with a cup of tea and told him to take a break. The weight of her memory filled the room steady and grounding. He sat there breathing deeply and repeated her words aloud for the first time in years. Money doesn't change a person, it just shows who they are. The sound of his own voice was firm, clear, and it didn't echo as much as he expected. It was as though the walls absorbed it, agreeing, holding the truth within their beams. The clarity sharpened his thoughts. Daniel's betrayal was not a surprise. It was a revelation, the unmasking of something Helen had seen long ago, and now that it was unmasked, there was no putting it back. He knew what his son valued, and he knew exactly where to strike. Every account, every property, every dollar that Daniel assumed was already his was in truth a string waiting to be cut. He leaned back in the chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, and allowed the pain to settle into purpose. Grief had taught him patience. Betrayal had taught him precision. Helen's words had given him clarity. Together they formed the foundation of what he would build next. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second stretching into the shape of decision. He imagined Daniel and Melissa in their resort suite, unpacking, laughing, congratulating themselves on their cleverness. He pictured their relief as they ordered room service, their certainty that the old man was safely tucked away, powerless. He almost smiled at the thought. Because power, as Helen used to remind him, was never about appearances. It was about patience, about knowing when to act and when to wait. He rose from the chair and crossed to the window, pulling the curtain back to look out at the quiet street. The night was still, the air crisp, and for the first time since the airport he felt steady, unshaken. He whispered Helen's words once more, not as memory this time, but as a vow. What his son thought was victory was only revelation. What Melissa believed was performance was only proof. And what they both failed to see was that the father they had dismissed had not been broken at all. He had been sharpened. The silence of the house deepened, heavy and watchful. In that silence he began to plan. What awaited Daniel and Melissa was not rage, not chaos, but clarity turned into action, and the first move, when it came, would feel to them like fate itself had turned against them. He crossed the hallway with a pace that was neither hurried nor hesitant, each step steady, deliberate, the sound of his shoes against the hardwood floor echoing through the quiet house. The study door groaned as it opened, and he entered the room as though stepping onto a battlefield. The scent of cedar and dust filled the air, grounding him, reminding him of the years he had spent here, drafting plans, balancing books, and carving out a life that others now took for granted. At the center of it all sat the oak desk, broad and solid, its surface polished smooth by decades of use. He had built it himself, shaping every joint, every curve with his own hands. It was more than furniture, it was an altar to the discipline that had defined his life. He lowered himself into the leather chair and placed his palms flat against the wood. For a long moment he sat still, letting the silence settle like ash. The humiliation at the airport replayed in fragments, the missing ticket, the clerk's apology, Melissa's sighs, Daniel's touch on his shoulder, the command to go home. Each piece cut deeper than the last, but now instead of reopening the wound, they hardened into resolve. The pain was still there, yes, but it had transformed, forged into something sharper. What had been sorrow was now a blueprint for action. His eyes moved to the phone resting on the corner of the desk. The device seemed to hum with possibility, its black screen reflecting his face, calm, but set with a determination that had not been there before. He reached for it, his hand steady, his fingers sure. The number he dialed was etched in his memory, a connection built over years of quiet trust. When the line clicked and the familiar voice answered, he didn't hesitate. "Richard," he said, his voice even deliberate, each word carved from stone. "We need to make some changes." On the other end, Richard Tran, his attorney and confidant for over 2 decades, responded with a calm professionalism. "What kind of changes?" The father leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed on the shelves lined with books and binders, records of every decision, every investment, every safeguard he had ever put in place. Everything tied to Daniel, he said. I want it secured, restructured, locked down, effective immediately. Richard didn't question the tone. He had heard it only a few times before, always before decisive moves that reshaped fortunes and secured legacies. Understood, he replied. I'll start the paperwork tonight, but I'll need specifics. They'll be on your desk in the morning, the father said. His hand tightened around the phone, his knuckles white, but his voice remained steady. I won't let him take another inch. Not 1 cent, not one deed. This ends now. The conversation continued in clipped, precise exchanges, strategy unfolding like a chess match. Trust accounts frozen, property titles adjusted, contingency plans drafted to ensure nothing could be touched without his direct approval. Every safeguard was another wall erected, another barrier between his son's greed and the empire he had built. When the call ended, the silence of the study returned heavier but no longer oppressive. He set the phone down carefully as though placing the final stone in a foundation. The blueprint was drawn now, not on paper, but in action. Daniel and Melissa had believed him powerless, discarded, erased. But in truth, they had triggered the awakening of something far more dangerous than anger. They had awakened strategy. He rose from the chair and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain to gaze out at the street. The neighborhood was quiet, the occasional car passing under the dim glow of streetlights. Beyond that stillness, he imagined Daniel and Melissa sipping cocktails in Hawaii, laughing at his expense, believing the old man had been defeated. He almost smiled at the thought. Let them laugh. Let them toast to their victory. They had no idea the ground beneath them was already shifting. His eyes moved back to the desk, to the tools of his past, the pens, the rulers, the stacks of paper. He picked up the old drafting pencil, its wood worn smooth from years of use, and rolled it between his fingers. Once he had used it to sketch homes, to design spaces where families would grow, love, and thrive. Tonight it would serve another purpose. Tonight it would sketch the outlines of a different kind of construction, not of walls and beams, but of consequences and reckoning. He began to write line after line, filling the notepad with instructions, notes, reminders. He listed accounts, properties, assets. Each word was a nail driven into the coffin of Daniel's illusions. He did not pause, did not waver. The clarity of purpose carried him forward sharper than any blade. Hours passed unnoticed, the clock on the wall ticking steadily, marking time, not as loss but as progress. When at last he set the pencil down, the pad was covered in his handwriting, page after page of strategy laid bare. He leaned back in the chair, exhaustion tugging at him but unable to penetrate the iron of his resolve. He thought again of Helen, her voice a steady echo in the back of his mind. Money doesn't change a person. It just shows who they are. She had been right all along, and now that truth would be the very weapon he wielded. The house creaked softly around him, the night settling deeper, but he felt no urge to sleep. Instead, he rose and walked to the door, pausing to glance back at the desk. The lamp cast a pool of light over the papers, illuminating the first tangible pieces of his plan. It looked almost sacred, like the altar of a new beginning. He turned off the light and stepped into the hallway, the darkness enveloping him. His footsteps echoed softly, but his mind was louder than ever, filled with the rhythm of strategy, of vengeance sharpened into resolve. Daniel and Melissa had wanted him gone, erased, forgotten. What they had done instead was awaken the architect within him, the man who built not only houses but legacies, the man who knew how to create and how to dismantle. And as he moved through the quiet house, his heart steady, his mind clear, he knew this was only the beginning. What awaited them would not be anger flung in haste or words shouted in desperation. It would be measured, deliberate, precise, the kind of response that left nothing standing when the dust cleared. The ink on the notepad was barely dry when he picked up the phone again. This time his voice carried none of the weariness that had trailed him from the airport. It was sharp, deliberate, stripped of hesitation. Richard listened on the other end as he laid out the first move with the precision of a general ordering troops into formation. The Sterling Family Trust, every account, every access point, every line of credit was to be frozen, effective immediately. No exceptions, no delays. Richard hesitated only long enough to confirm the authority, then began the process. By morning, Daniel's assumptions of power would dissolve like mist. When he hung up, the silence of the study felt different. It was no longer oppressive, no longer filled with humiliation. It was alive, charged with the hum of victory before the enemy even realized the battle had begun. He leaned back in the leather chair, his eyes roaming over the desk he had built with his own hands, and felt a quiet satisfaction seep into him. For the first time since Helen's passing, he was not adrift. He was in control again, shaping events instead of being shaped by them. The papers on the desk glowed under the lamp's circle of light. He sifted through them, pulling out the draft of the letter he would send to Daniel. It was not angry. It was not pleading. It was formal, concise, as cold as steel. By the time Daniel's plane touched down in Hawaii, the words would be waiting for him delivered straight to his inbox. The message was clear: access denied, accounts restricted, trust secured. It was not a warning, it was a declaration. He imagined the scene vividly, almost like watching it unfold on a screen. Daniel stepping off the plane, Melissa chattering about the resort, the children dragging their carry-ons with excitement. He would switch on his phone, expecting texts of congratulations, confirmations of reservations, perhaps even a message from his father begging forgiveness. Instead, he would see the subject line from Richard's office, the kind of stark legal phrasing that drained color from the face: notification of access suspension. He would open it, confusion giving way to panic as he scrolled through the details. Melissa would peer over his shoulder, her smile faltering. And in that moment, on the warm shores of Hawaii, their paradise would begin to unravel. The father's lips curled into the faintest smile as he folded the letter and slid it into an envelope. He placed it in the center of the desk, the paper weight holding it down like a seal on a decree. He didn't need to imagine Daniel's reaction too long, it was inevitable. The boy had grown used to thinking of the trust as his own, a treasure chest waiting to be opened. What he would realize now was that the chest had always had a lock, and the key had never left his father's pocket. He stood and crossed to the bookshelf, pulling down a binder thick with records. The Sterling Family Trust was not just money. It was the culmination of decades of work, investments, carefully chosen properties, acquired risks, taken and rewarded. It was the skeleton of the family's future, and it bore his fingerprints on every page. Daniel might have thought himself heir to it all, but heirs are named, not assumed. Tonight that assumption was shattered. He traced his hand over the spine of the binder, feeling the embossed letters, and thought of Helen again. She would have approved of this move. She had always urged caution, always reminded him that generosity should not blind him to greed. He had resisted her warnings for years, hoping that love and sacrifice could mold Daniel into the man he wanted him to be. But love had not changed him. Money had revealed him. And now money would also restrain him. Returning to the desk, he drafted a second document, instructions for Richard to transfer temporary oversight of the trust to an external administrator, someone loyal only to the law and to him. It was an added safeguard, a second wall erected against intrusion. As his pen scratched across the page, he felt a surge of control return, stronger than any apology or reconciliation could have given him. He no longer cared for Daniel's approval. He no longer needed Melissa's false smiles. All that mattered was the fortress of his legacy, secured brick by brick against those who would plunder it. The clock struck midnight, its chime low and steady. He did not flinch. Instead, he gathered the papers, stacked them neatly, and sealed them in a folder. Tomorrow, they would be delivered. By the time Daniel reached his hotel room, expecting champagne and ocean views, he would instead be greeted by the icy grip of consequences. The father rose and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. The houses were dark, the world asleep, but his mind was alive, thrumming with the energy of regained control. The shame of the airport had evaporated, replaced by the quiet hum of victory's first notes. They thought they had exiled him, stripped him of power, sent him home to fade. But what they had really done was drive him back to the seat of his strength, to the desk where he built legacies and ended illusions. He whispered into the stillness, not as a vow, but as a simple truth. It's mine. It always has been. The lamp flickered slightly. the shadows shifting across the walls, and he turned back to the desk. The envelope with Daniel's name on it lay waiting a silent executioner that required no violence, no raised voice. Just paper and ink sharpened into weapons. He allowed himself a final breath of satisfaction, the kind that comes not from rage but from precision, from the knowledge that the game had turned and the board was now his to command. Daniel and Melissa were still celebrating in ignorance, still smiling in their seats above the Pacific. By the time they landed, they would understand. The man they thought they had cast aside had not only returned to power, he had never left it. And this was only the opening move. The sun was setting in a blaze of orange and gold when Daniel and Melissa stepped off the shuttle and onto the polished driveway of the resort. Palm trees swayed in the humid breeze, their fronds rattling softly above the marble steps that led to the grand entrance. The children darted ahead, their laughter ringing out as they pointed to the pools glittering under the last rays of light. Daniel inhaled deeply, the scent of salt and hibiscus filling his lungs. He felt triumphant. This was what victory smelled like. Behind him, the door to the shuttle thudded shut, and the driver pulled away, leaving them with their luggage and their smug certainty that the old man was out of the picture. Melissa slipped her sunglasses higher on her nose and touched his arm, her voice low, syrupy. "We did it, Danny. Now we can relax." He gave her a grin, the grin of a man convinced the world had bent to his will. Together they walked into the lobby where polished floors gleamed like mirrors and staff greeted them with rehearsed warmth. Daniel handed over his platinum card with a flourish, already imagining the suite that awaited them, the champagne that would be chilling on ice. The clerk swiped the card once. A pause. She swiped again. The smile on her face faltered. Daniel's own grin stiffened as he leaned forward. "Run it again," he said lightly, his confidence unshaken. She did, and the screen flashed the same message. "Declined." She cleared her throat. "Sir, I'm afraid—" "No." Daniel interrupted, his voice sharper now that card has no limit. "Try it again." Melissa glanced around, her cheeks coloring as other guests turned their heads. The children stopped laughing, sensing the shift in their parents' tone. The clerk tried once more, tapping at the keyboard, her brow furrowed. "Declined." The word might as well have been carved into the air, hard and permanent. Daniel's phone buzzed on the counter. He yanked it from his pocket, relief already forming in his mind. A simple fraud alert, maybe. Some bank glitch. But the screen lit up with a subject line colder than ice: notification of access suspension. It came from Richard Tran's office. His stomach twisted. He opened the email, his eyes skimming the lines that confirmed his worst fear. Effective immediately, all access to the Sterling Family Trust was frozen pending review. Funds, accounts, properties untouchable. His father's name signed at the bottom like a ghost rising from the grave he had dug for him. Melissa leaned closer, her eyes scanning the screen, her lips parting in horror. What does this mean?" Her voice cracked, the false confidence she wore like perfume dissipating in the humid air. Daniel's chest tightened, a cold sweat breaking across his skin. He tried another card, then another, each one tied to the trust, each one flashing the same rejection. The clerk's politeness hardened into distance, her smile gone. Her voice clipped as she asked if he had another form of payment. Behind them, guests shuffled impatiently, their stares boring into his back. Melissa's whisper was frantic now. "Danny, fix this. Do something." The children tugged at her dress, asking what was wrong, their voices shrill in the marble cavern of the lobby. Daniel's hand shook as he gripped the counter. For the first time he had no answer, no excuse, no charm that could undo the blow. The realization hit with the force of a wave crashing against rock. His father had known. He had not left the airport broken. He had gone home silent but deadly, and struck where it hurt most. The trust wasn't Daniel's to control. It never had been. The security he flaunted, the power he boasted, all of it had been borrowed from a man he had just discarded like luggage left on a curb. And now the bill had come due. Melissa's face paled as she stepped back, her eyes darting around the lobby as though searching for an escape. "We can't pay for the room," she hissed, her voice barely more than a breath. We can't even pay for dinner." The clerk cleared her throat again, her tone strained with patience. "Sir, if you can't provide payment, I'm afraid—" "Stop!" Daniel barked, his voice echoing too loudly, cracking under the weight of panic. Heads turned. A couple whispered. The children's eyes brimmed with tears. Melissa pressed her hand to her forehead, her composure shattered. Daniel lowered his voice, his words desperate. "Please, just give me a minute. This isn't possible." But even as he spoke, he knew it was. His father's silence at the airport had not been weakness. It had been calculation. Every moment since then had been preparation for this exact strike. The children whimpered. Melissa grabbed their hands, her jaw tight, her eyes furious. "This is your fault," she spat, her voice trembling. "You promised everything was under control." Her anger only deepened, the hollow pit opening in his chest. He had promised, and for a moment he had believed it. Now the illusion had dissolved under fluorescent lights and polished marble. The clerk stepped back, her expression impassive. "Sir, if you'd like, we can hold your reservation until tomorrow. But unless another form of payment is provided, I can't release the suite tonight." Daniel nodded stiffly, gathering the card, sliding the phone into his pocket, though the words of the email still burned in his mind. Notification of access suspension. Each syllable cut like glass. He felt the stares of strangers again, just as his father had at the airport. But this time it was his turn to stand in the spotlight of humiliation. The irony twisted in his gut, sickening and sharp. He turned away, his voice low, brittle. "Come on, let's step outside." Melissa followed, dragging the children, her heels striking the marble with a violent rhythm. Outside, the warm air clung to them, heavy, suffocating. The lights of the resort glowed behind them, taunting, unreachable. Daniel leaned against the railing, his head in his hands. Melissa hovered close, her voice seething with panic. "What are we supposed to do now? We don't have cash, we don't have cards, we don't have anything." He didn't answer. There was nothing to say. The empire he thought he had inherited had vanished in a single email. His father had reclaimed it with the precision of a man who built and dismantled with equal skill. And for the first time, Daniel felt something he had never imagined possible. Not confidence, not control, not superiority. He felt fear. The night was just beginning, and already paradise had turned into exile. The phone rang for the third time that night, its shrill tone cutting through the silence of the house. He sat in his study, the lamp casting a warm circle of light across the desk, and he didn't move. The sound echoed against the wooden beams, sharp and insistent, but he let it play out steady as stone. He knew who it was before even glancing at the caller ID. Daniel. The same son who had patted him on the shoulder at the airport and sent him home like an afterthought. The same son who had walked into a Hawaiian resort with a swagger, only to watch the ground crumble beneath him. Now the calls came not out of love, not out of remorse, but out of desperation. The phone fell silent, then started again almost immediately. He didn't flinch. He leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin, and allowed himself the rare luxury of stillness. Each ring was a confession, every unanswered call a mirror, reflecting the truth they hadn't wanted him at their side. They hadn't cared for his presence. They only cared for the vault they believed was theirs to plunder. And now that vault was closed, the key turned the lock secure. The panic on the other end of the line was not about him, it was about money. For years he had been the quiet provider, the man in the background, building a legacy brick by brick. He had thought sacrifice could buy loyalty, that generosity could purchase gratitude. Helen had warned him, her words echoing now in the back of his mind. Money doesn't change a person, it just shows who they are. Tonight, the truth of her wisdom was undeniable. The ringing of the phone was not the sound of family reaching for a father. It was the sound of creditors calling their debtor. The answering machine clicked, and his son's voice spilled into the room, thin and frantic. "Dad, listen, there's been some mistake. The cards, the accounts. We can't get into anything. Can you just call me back? Please?" The message ended abruptly, but within moments the ringing resumed. He smiled faintly, not cruelly, but with the calm satisfaction of a man who had finally stopped feeding a fire that only consumed. He rose from the chair and walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside. The street outside was quiet, the trees still, the night air heavy with the scent of pine. The world had slowed to a steady rhythm, and in that stillness he found something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Not because he had struck back, not because he had won some petty battle, but because he had finally reclaimed himself. His dignity, once trampled, now stood tall again, unbent. The phone rang again. He let it. He poured himself a glass of water, the sound of it filling the tumbler steady and smooth. He took a sip, savoring its coolness, grounding himself in the simplicity of the act. There was power and restraint in choosing not to answer, not to give them the satisfaction of hearing his voice. He had spoken enough in his life, given enough, carried enough. Tonight silence spoke louder than words. He thought of the moment at the airport, the sting of humiliation as strangers watched, and realized it no longer haunted him. That shame had burned away, leaving behind only clarity. His son's words, "Just go home, Dad. We'll bring you a souvenir," had been intended to erase him. But instead, they had revealed the truth. He had been more than a father to Daniel. He had been a bank, a safety net, a resource to be tapped. And now that the tap had run dry, desperation howled down the phone line. The machine clicked again, Melissa's voice cutting in this time, brittle and strained. "We can't even check into the hotel, do you understand? This is embarrassing. Everyone's looking at us. Just fix this. You can't leave us like this." Her tone wasn't sorrowful. It wasn't regret. It was entitlement stripped bare. The plea wasn't for a father's forgiveness, but for a financier's rescue. He set the glass down on the desk and sat once more in the chair. The lamp glowed softly, illuminating the documents stacked neatly, the trust sealed under his authority, every account secured. For years he had worried about being forgotten, being left behind as age crept in. Tonight he understood something deeper. It wasn't being forgotten that destroyed a man. It was being used, drained, diminished until there was nothing left. He had stopped that cycle. Not with shouting, not with violence, but with quiet resolve. The phone rang again. He didn't move. Instead, he reached for the notepad he had filled earlier with notes and plans. He flipped through the pages, slowly reading his own handwriting, steady and strong. These weren't just strategies. They were proof of control. Proof that his story hadn't ended at the gate. It had only begun. He leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment, and thought of Helen again. He could almost see her in the doorway, her hands folded, her expression proud. She had always believed in dignity above all else. Tonight, he had honored that belief. The vengeance wasn't in freezing accounts or writing letters. The vengeance was in silence, in refusing to be reduced, in reclaiming the ground beneath his feet. The phone went quiet at last. The house breathed around him, settling into the night. He felt the weight lift from his chest, replaced by something lighter, freer. He was no longer waiting for respect to be handed to him. He had taken it back. He rose once more, turned off the lamp, and stepped into the darkened hallway. The floorboards creaked softly under his feet, familiar, welcoming. Behind him the study stood in shadow. The desk solid, the papers secure, the phone silent. Ahead of him stretched the rest of the night, calm and unbroken. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man waiting to be discarded. He felt like a man who had chosen his own ending and his own beginning. Daniel and Melissa would learn in time that a father's silence could be the loudest lesson of all. And when they did, they would remember not the money they lost, but the dignity they could never steal. The night deepened, the quiet settling over the house like a blanket. He climbed the stairs, each step firm, unhurried, certain. In the distance, the phone rang again, but he didn't turn back. He had already answered in the only way that mattered. Life has a way of revealing the truth about people not through their words, but through their actions when money and power are at stake. This story reminds us that sacrifice and generosity, while noble, can sometimes blind us to the selfishness of those closest to us. True character is not created by wealth, it is exposed by it. For older adults, the lesson is clear. Dignity is not something others grant. It is something we claim for ourselves by setting boundaries and refusing to be used. Protecting what we've built is not vengeance but wisdom, ensuring that respect is given where it is deserved. In silence and restraint, there is often more power than in anger. The greatest justice is not in shouting at betrayal, but in living with self-respect and letting the consequences speak for themselves. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful tales that remind us of life's deepest lessons.